If you would like to know if a Christian is able to start a business, I'm going to break that down in today's video. And I'm going to look at 3 examples from the New Testament to help you understand this question and have total clarity. Some of you watching this may be thinking to yourself, well, this is like an obvious answer. But then at the same time, I know there's so many Christians out there who would think about a situation like this and think, well, no, of course Christians are not able to start businesses because that's going into the pursuit of money and loving money, and then obviously the love of money is the root of all evil, etc., etc. So, like I said, we're going to look at 3 examples in today's video. 2 of them it all makes sense anyway. So, yes, to answer the question simply, you are able to start a business, to engage in business, to even have a profitable business, right? If you are a Christian, right? I'm very bullish on business. I think most Christians should have a business if possible, because it really creates so much option for believers on so many different levels, let alone if we start talking about spreading the gospel and funding missions and all of that kind of good stuff. When you read through the New Testament passages, I'm not going to talk about that really in today's video. You see that over and over again, it's people who are placed in specific positions, who have finances, who have resources, who are able to then fund different people in regards to ministry. And there's no reason why that can't be you or anybody else who starts a business, has success, and is able to fund ministries in that way, or at least even your own ministry. So 3 examples. I want to start with the first example. The first example I want to speak about in today's video is a man, a very important, significant man of the New Testament. And it's the man who wrote most of the New Testament books in the Bible, Paul the Apostle. And many people don't understand this or even know this, that Paul was a big businessman. And what I mean by that, he was into business, right? If you read through a lot of Paul's letters, he continues to emphasize the fact that he was focused on working with his own hands, doing his business, his activity, in order to not be a burden on the people. Right. So many people, before we look at a passage, right, where it spells this out quite clearly, but many people will look at that sort of scenario and think, well, if someone goes off and works in order to finance what they're doing, that's problematic. When really and truly, that's what we see over and over again in the biblical text in regards to what people are doing. So let's look at this passage right here. This is Acts chapter 18. And this is talking about Paul, as you can see here. And starting at verse 1, we'll read a couple of verses. It says, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla. Famous couple. We'll talk about them more later on in today's video. And it says, because that Claudius Caesar, had commanded all Jews to depart to leave Rome, and came unto them. And it says, because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought. So he was working, for by their occupation, they were tent makers. So in simple terms, this is a passage here which is showcasing that Paul the Apostle, his business, his skill, his craft, right, his area of expertise was making tents. Right, he would go around, and the reason why this is so significant, right, is because I mentioned this in a video I did recently, where I was talking about how Paul was in a prime position, and now it makes a lot more sense when you think about Paul being able to travel around different places, different countries, and preach the gospel. Is because he had a skill, he had a craft, a business, which was tent making, which when you think about it, was very wise. It was ingenious. He could go and sell tents wherever he went, because in the time period where he was living, even still to today, to be honest, but in the time period when he was living, they were very nomadic people. They would go from one place to the other. They would travel. And when people travel, they would need stuff like tents if they haven't got somewhere to stay, etc. So Paul was a tent maker. That was his business. That was his occupation. And he could go around in the different places. And obviously he was selling those tents. Again, like I mentioned previously, when you read through Paul's letters, he's continually saying, look, we've been working night and day. We've been putting the work in order to not be a burden. And the reason why this is such a powerful example, at least in my opinion, is because, like I said previously, Paul wrote most of the New Testament books. So from that perspective, if someone who God has given the blessing of writing so much of the New Testament is focused on doing business, why would it be an issue for us to start a business and even expect and desire that business to be profitable in order to fund the stuff that we're doing, provide for our family, provide for the ministry stuff that we do, etc., or support other ministries? You get to decide ultimately. Now we're going to come back to that passage later on in the video, but I want us to go on to the second example. And this is really a collection of people in this particular example. So really it's more than 3 people. So I'm talking about 2 sets of brothers. Again, Paul was very significant in the New Testament. These 2 sets of brothers are also very significant as well. And these were also people who had options, just like Paul did. And it makes so much more sense now how they were able to travel around and do their ministry because of the skill that they had, which they were able to use in order to help fund the stuff that they're doing, let alone before anybody else decided to fund and help them get around and travel and spread the gospel. So I'm talking about Peter and Andrew, set of brothers, and obviously James and John. And you can look at this passage right here. This is in Mark chapter 1, verse 16 to 20. You can read this in the other gospel accounts as well, but this is a nice succinct place where we can just look at a few verses and see this quite clearly. So it says, "Now as he walked by the Sea of Galilee," speaking about Jesus, "he saw Simon, Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers," right? They were fishermen. They were in the fishing business. And it's quite obvious that's the case when we continue reading, as I'm going to continue. But just like Paul had his tent making business, he would go around, he didn't have a problem selling tents, obviously because he's providing a good service to people who need it. These individuals, Simon and Andrew, obviously Peter is the leader of the disciples, and obviously James and John, as we're going to read about as well, are also the other 2 disciples, which were in the sort of inner circle, the 3 like main core disciples, which are with Jesus on special occasions, right, where the other disciples don't necessarily get to go to. As we can see, they were in the business of fishing. They would go around, and again, they were in the Mediterranean. They had, people in that place had a Mediterranean diet. So fish was a big part of that diet. So imagine you've got Simon and Andrew and James and John, as we're going to see in a moment. They are fishermen. They get to fish. They get to eat the fish for them, to provide for their family with the fish, but also get to sell fish. And also people can buy that fish, etc. So notice what it says in verse 17. And Jesus said unto them, "Come ye after me," so follow me, "and I will make you to become fishers of men," right? So it's not a surprise a lot of the time where God will use skills that you have and he will flip it and turn it to be like, okay, cool, you've done, this is the skill you have, or this is what you have. Now you're going to use it in this way, i.e. I'm going to show you how to become a fisher of men. It's God using what we have and relating the stuff that he wants us to do to those things. And then it says in 18, "And straightway," so right away, "they forsook their nets and followed him." And even when you think about it, like, they've obviously seen Jesus do some great stuff. Jesus is saying, "Come and follow me." And they let go of everything and start following him. And again, it makes a lot more sense why they would be willing to do that, because they're not necessarily bound to a particular location. And that's one of the benefits of having a business and not necessarily just working a job or anything along those lines. With a business, a specific type of business, if you start your business in the right way, it gives you the flexibility to move around and to do much more than most people can. And in 19 it says, "And when he had gone a little further thence, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, who also were in the ship mending their nets." So obviously the implication before we read the next verse is obviously they're going to fish together. If Jesus is walking down on the seashore in Galilee and he sees Peter and Andrew, and then he continues to walk a little bit more and he sees James and John, obviously they are obviously in close proximity. They most likely went out to fish together. Even when you read other passages in the New Testament, it spells out quite clearly, talking about how they were partners, basically. But notice what it says here in verse 20. "And straight away he called them, and they left their father Zebedee," James and John that is, "in the ship with the hired servants and went after him." So just like Peter and Andrew before them followed Jesus, right? Just as Jesus called them, James and John leave their father and they leave their hired servants, which again is another telltale sign. It's clear that this is not just some, "Oh, we're just doing this by ourselves." They've got hired servants that are working alongside them. They've got a partnership. The 2 sets of brothers have a partnership, and they've also got hired servants, hired help. They're paying people. We'd call that an employee today, right? Or a freelancer, right, etc. We've got these people who are working alongside, And again, these individuals, they're traveling all around and there's water in so many different places. They could take this skill that they have, which is knowing how to fish. Paul can take the skill that he has, which is knowing how to make tents. And they can travel around and do different things and also use that skill in order to provide for their family and whatever other resources they may need. Now, I said earlier, I want to go back to the passage in Acts chapter 18 because the third example I want to talk about is in that passage. So remember, initially I came to this passage to speak about Paul, right? Key figure in the New Testament in the first century. I also remember who it said that Paul was obviously meeting here in this particular passage. It talked about this married couple, Aquila, with his wife, Priscilla. Now, as you continue to read into the New Testament, you read about Aquila and Priscilla having a church, right? So they're pastoring a church, if you want to put it in those terms. But notice what it said about them as well, right? In verse 3. Speaking of Paul, because he was of the same craft, they did the same stuff. He stayed with them, right? It made sense. You know what? You do the exact same thing as me. Let's stay together and let's work together, right? Partnership. Now you can see how it makes sense what I was talking about before about Peter and Andrew brothers, and James and John brothers, right? And what they're partners, they're working together. Because if you are like in the same line of work and you're both into ministry and it makes sense, and it fits, it makes sense why Paul would partner with them. And obviously Luke spells it out here in Acts just by saying, for by their occupation, their work, they were tent makers. So you've got Paul the Apostle, key figure in the New Testament. You've got Peter and Andrew, James and John, key disciples. And you have Aquila and Priscilla, who were pastoring a church in the first century in the book of Acts. And all of these different individuals were involved in business in one way, shape or form. So if you are curious, if you're thinking about, well, can I start a business as a Christian? Hopefully this video has helped you answer that question. If you have any more questions, leave them in the comment section below and I'll see you on the next video. God bless and I'll see you soon.